Okay, welcome everyone to Neuro 140, Biological and Artificial Intelligence. My name is Gabriel Kreiman, and I'm going to be the main faculty in this class. Part of the idea of this course, this is a new class, and part of the idea here is to bring you a new perspective and very different perspectives on how people are studying the combination of biological and artificial intelligence. So there will be multiple lectures by several people. I'm only one of them. But I'm going to be the main person in charge of the class. This person right here is Nimrod. He's the main TA for the class. We're trying to secure one or two more TAs, potentially some who are actually here now, but I'm not going to make any announcements yet until we determine that for sure. I want to start very soon talking about science and biology and machines. And I'm going to relegate most of the logistics about the class to the last 10, 15 minutes of the class. But I want to make a couple of very quick announcements. We're going to be filming most, if not all, of the lectures. So there's a paper that's circulating, and we're asking you to sign that. That's just a consent form. Most of you will not appear in the video, except when you ask amazing questions. But we still want you to sign the consent form for these videos. We're told that these videos will appear online a couple of days after each lecture. Most of you should have access to all the materials through the Harvard Canvas website. If for whatever reason you don't have access to that, you can also go to this website, and we're going to put slides as well as reading materials, as well as other announcements in here. But all of that should be in the Canvas website as well. There's also a link here to a form that Nimrod prepared just to get a sense of who you are, your background, and what year you're in, and what you're studying here. I am well aware that I have a very thick accent. On top of that, today I have a cold. So I hope you'll understand 50–60% of what I'm saying. But I'd like to encourage every one of you to ask questions and make this interactive. I do understand that many of you come from very different backgrounds. You may be very familiar with some of the material that we're going to be talking about in the class, and not at all familiar with other aspects of the class. So please do interrupt and ask questions. So I'm going to come back to more logistic issues at the end. And I want to start essentially at the end of the story. Many years ago, a professor of statistics by the name of I.J. Good made this rather provocative and interesting statement, saying that the first ultra-intelligent machine that we ever build is the last machine that we ever need to build. The idea being that once we surpass human intelligence, that machine will be able to solve other problems, design other machines, and build all sorts of other machines. I forgot to mention that due to increased enrollment, we had to move locations at the last minute. So I see that there are some people coming in. I hope that you didn't go all the way to biolabs. We're going to be staying in this room. So the idea is that there's a special time when we actually can surpass human intelligence. And throughout, over the years, this idea has been has evolved and has been modified in several ways. And some people even refer to this notion today as the singularity, the idea that we can potentially surpass human intelligence. There are fundamental laws of physics that suggest that we cannot go beyond the speed of light, or that we cannot go beyond the speed of light, or that we cannot go below absolute zero Kelvin in temperature, but there's no physical limit to intelligence. Humans are rather cute creatures, but there's nothing really particularly impressive or distinct about our own intelligence. There's no reason why we should not be able to build machines that are better and more intelligent than we are. So I.J. Good worked during the Second World War alongside Alan Turing, who I'm sure many of you have heard of. He's considered to be the father of computation. They worked together breaking breaking codes and trying to decipher communications among the Germans. And Alan Turing is famous for many things. One of them is for creating what we know now as the Turing test. The idea behind the Turing test is the following. Imagine that we have two rooms. These are two locked rooms. You cannot peek inside. You don't know what's inside. In one of them, there's a machine, purportedly an intelligent machine. And in the other one, there's a human. You can ask questions. You can ask any question you want. In those days, there was no texting, no email, so you would pass those questions below the door. You would pass handwritten questions, and then they would produce typewritten answers that they would pass back to you. So if we cannot distinguish where the machine is and where the human is, we say that this machine has passed the Turing test. So this is a general statement about any possible question. There are people who have defined specialized versions of the Turing test. So for example, we can have a Turing test about vision. Can we understand images? We can have a Turing test specifically about naming all the prime ministers in New Zealand. You can have a Turing test about any specialized domain that you may want. And in many of those cases, machines have already surpassed or have already passed the Turing test. Of course, in most of those cases, when a machine beats humans or passes the Turing test, the first reaction from most people is to say, oh, but that's not intelligence. That's just an algorithm. That's just memorization, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm going to come back to that idea. I would argue, together with many other people, I would argue that studying intelligence and solving the problem of intelligence is the greatest problem of science. This will have tremendous impact in all sorts of domains. Of course, in terms of engineering applications, in terms of being able to build all kinds of machines that can do useful things, but also because of the impact that will have on other sciences and being able to do other sciences better. And in addition to that, being able to solve the problem of intelligence may help us and have a major impact in terms of social interactions, in terms of politics, in terms of education, in terms of addressing mental diseases as well. There's hardly a day that goes by now without a new announcement of major achievements by artificial intelligent devices. And these are some major accomplishments over the last several years, several decades, that some of you are probably very familiar with. We have machines that can beat world champions in chess or in Go or in Jeopardy. Even though I have a very thick accent, I am quite surprised by devices that can understand what I'm saying and respond to what I'm saying. As a matter of fact, it's often the case that when I talk to a native speaker, I need to repeat myself. And that happens less and less often these days with devices. So these are pretty good. Without any training, they can capture spoken language. And then there is, of course, a lot of progress in terms of self-driving cars. I should clarify that this is not a real experiment. This is just an advertisement here. So we have already devices in production and being tested that can navigate automatically in the real world. Okay, so despite these tremendous advances in artificial intelligence, it's still the case that the most sophisticated computational device that we know of, the best type of intelligence that we know of on this planet, is inside here. It's actually the human brain. So we think it's fundamental for us to be able to understand the human brain. The human brain is what's responsible ultimately for taking us to the moon, for solving mathematical problems that were open for centuries, for helping us come up with antibiotics and treatments for diseases, for elucidating the structure of the double helix, and many other scientific accomplishments. So all of that and much more happening here. So the best, if we want to really understand intelligence, if we want to have systems that are able of generalized artificial intelligence, our best bet right now, I would argue, is to understand what's happening inside the brain, to understand neuroscience. So I'm going to give a couple of basic introductory comments about neuroscience. The fundamental unit of computation in the brain is the neuron. This is an actual staining of a neuron. Neurons have three main compartments. There are dendrites, which convey input from other neurons. There's a soma, which is the central place where information is integrated. And then all of the information from a neuron is conveyed via the axon to other neurons. There are plenty of seats here for the people who are sitting, who are standing in the back. Don't be shy, and come on in. So this basic unit of computation can be abstracted and conceptualized in this type of diagram, which basically reflects the main unit of computation in a lot, if not most, of the type of neural network architectures that people build these days. So the idea is that you have an axon from a previous neuron that's conveying a signal. In this case, we represent that signal by a scalar number that corresponds to the activity of the presynaptic neuron. These varicosities here, these very small points here are called spines, and those are the main connections between one neuron and the next neuron. Each synapse, each connection has a particular strength that we typically denote by a value W. That's the weight or strength of that synapse. And that basically describes what's the impact that this presynaptic neuron has on this particular unit. So in this case, there are three inputs to this neuron. In real biological systems, real neurons may have hundreds, if not thousands, of such inputs. This cell body is basically computing a dot product of those input activations denoted by X and those W's. And after summing those W's times X, there's an activation function, some sort of nonlinearity that converts all of these inputs into an output. So this is the fundamental unit of computation. And by putting together many such units, we can create neural networks with fascinating emergent properties, even though this is a very simplified version, an abstract version of what's actually happening in real neurons. So this is a particular neural network. We refer to this as layers. So this is a neural network that has 4 layers. The architecture of the network is what ultimately defines what's the basic structure in terms of how many units are placed in each of these layers. Each of these units is in turn connected to many of the other neurons or many of the other units in the network. And at the end, there's an output, and that output specifies what you're trying to accomplish, such as, for example, determining what particular object is present in an image, or making some sort of decision based on auditory input, or based on some sort of classification problem. In many approaches in building neural networks, people decide on this type of architecture from the very onset, based on intuition, based on trial and error, or perhaps based on some sort of exhaustive search over architectures. And what most people end up playing with and spending a lot of time with is trying to figure out how we can learn the structure of the problem and how we can modify those weights, those connections between different neurons to actually try to solve the types of tasks that we're very interested in. In this particular diagram, information flows only in one direction. We refer to these as feed-forward networks, where information is unidirectional. But it doesn't necessarily have to be that case. So the neural networks can have connections within one of these layers. There could be connections that go the other way. That is what we sometimes refer to as top-down connections. And you can imagine all sorts of different types of architectures. And one hot problem right now in AI and neural networks is to try to come up with automatic or developmental ways or biologically inspired ways to try to come up with good architectures, efficient architectures to solve different types of problems without having to impose this architecture from the onset. So as I argued, in order to build better AI and better machines, we need to study the brain. And one of the difficult aspects of studying neuroscience and studying brains is that the brains span multiple orders of magnitude in terms of space as well as in time. We can study brains at looking at structures that are below 1 micron, which is what happens at the level of the synapse or even ion channels, all the way to whole networks that may span multiple centimeters. At the same time, we can study sub-millisecond computations all the way to developmental processes that may take place over days or weeks or months. And to study the brain at these different scales, there is a plethora of different techniques that are available. And I would argue that in order to decipher biological algorithms, in order to truly understand the inner workings of the brain and fundamental computations, we need to look at the activity of individual neurons. We need to look at multiple individual neurons, how they interact with one another, and how computations and algorithms may emerge from those activations. To study the activity of individual neurons in humans is possible, but extremely complicated. In most cases, it's illegal to go inside a human brain and try to figure out how neurons work. And so for that purpose, it's quite important to be able to study animal models. And well, some of these videos may not be working. You were supposed to see here a lot of cute videos of animals doing fancy things. The important point that I want to make is that intelligence is not an exclusive or trademark property of the human brain. Animals are very intelligent too. And animals can do a lot of computations that surpass many of the most sophisticated AI algorithms that we have today. So this is across the animal kingdom, showing that animals have evolved to perform a wide variety of computations, and that it's in our best interest to understand how those computations are performed, both at the behavioral level, but also in terms of the inner workings of the brain. And many of the types of technologies and techniques that we have to study neuroscience are strongly dependent on the ability to be able to study animals in addition to humans. So let me give you one example, one famous example that started essentially a long tradition of experiments in neuroscience, as well as a long tradition of extremely successful computational models. As a matter of fact, many of the super successful computational architectures that we know of today that are making headlines in the newspapers can to some extent be traced back to some of these pioneering experiments by these two people here called David Hubel and Thorsten Wiesel. So working first with cats, what they did was use very small that was inserted in the part of the brain called primary visual cortex, and they discovered that neurons in primary visual cortex perform pretty sophisticated what you're seeing here is the type of stimulus that they're showing to the cat or to the monkey. In this case, they're showing bars of hidden orientations, these are built-in bars. What they discover is that neurons in primary visual cortex are strongly tuned to the strongly vigorously upon presentation of these and that's something that you can see so here you have realize, for example, this is a vertical bar, and each one of these bars corresponds to an action plan, the fundamental all or none events that the neurons use to propagate. So when you present this vertical bar of those applications. But when we present a bar at this type of orientation, the neuron fires back. So we say that this neuron is tuned to this orientation, like this Nobel Prize for this discovery. And this was quite important because it showed that the selected tuning of neurons. Furthermore, they went on to suggest a mechanism by which we can actually achieve this type of computation from the type of neurons that are played. So up until information which is primary visual cortex, most of the neurons have what's called a center surround that responds particularly to what's applied in one neuron. They put together multiple of these center surround circuits with the appropriate alignment of the neuron. You can build a neuron that has this type of neurons do not make any sounds. The kind of sounds that you're hearing here correspond to an amplification device that they use that is like to be able to orientate the signals from those neurons, but immediately on the radio. You see that when you're presenting the orientation of the neural light, this type of computation further happens throughout the entire visual field. The idea is that you have exactly the same computation happening in different places, so that you can detect that particular stimulus This type of response is what they call a simple cell, and that's in opposition to another type of cell that is called complex cell. The distinction between the simple cells and the complex cells is that the complex cells respond to the same favorite orientation of the cell, but with a certain degree of invariance or covariance in the exact position. This combination of selectivity and covariance to the exact position is fundamental to be able to achieve extrapolation and invariance transformations. So here there are two ideas. One is that the same computation happens over all different positions of the visual field, that you can achieve selectivity through these filtering mechanisms, and that you can combine many of these simple cells that are tuned to a particular orientation through a pooling mechanism to achieve invariance. So here is some basic ingredients of some of the main computational algorithms that we have today that are so successful in a wide variety of intelligent recognition tasks. So the first one is this idea of a filtering operation that happens throughout the entire visual field. So in the neural network jargon, this gave rise to the idea of convolutional layers, the idea that you can essentially specify a particular way of extracting information, and through a mechanism called weight sharing, you can have the same computation repeated over and over in different parts of the image. Another idea that came from neuroscience is the notion of normalization. Sometimes you want to achieve specificity while normalizing for nuisance variables that you're less interested in, for example, the overall intensity of illumination in the scene. And for that purpose, there's multiple studies that have described that neurons can perform a normalization operation to be able to look at relative changes as opposed to absolute values. And this gave rise to the idea of normalization layers in neural networks. I briefly mentioned the idea of the basic unit of computation being directly inspired by the biophysics of individual neurons. So this idea that you can compute a dot product between inputs and weights followed by an activation function. So that idea, again, was translated from these input-output curves of neurons into the type of activation functions that we inject into neural networks. One of the simplest versions of that is what's called a rectifying linear unit. A rectifying linear unit is nothing more and nothing less than a unit that receives input. If the inputs are below a certain threshold, the output is 0. If the inputs are above a certain threshold, the output is saturated, and in between there's a linear interpolation. So that's one of the most basic type of input-output functions that you can have. The idea of the complex cells, those individual cells that are tuned to orientation, to particular orientation, irrespective of the exact location of the stimulus within the receptive field of the neuron, gave rise to the idea of having pooling layers in neural networks. There has been a lot of interest in the neuroscience community in studying plasticity, that is, in studying the mechanisms by which synapses can be modified and strengthened or weakened depending on experience. And many of those ideas about plasticity gave rise to algorithms for learning and implementing weight changes in neural networks. One of the most famous ones that's used extensively right now in neural networks is the idea of backpropagation. Once you have a particular goal for the output units, you backpropagate the error throughout the entire cascade of the neural network, and you're making changes in each one of those weights in mechanisms that are approximated by some of the plasticity rules present in biological systems. Another curious property of neurons is that they tend to be quite capricious. Sometimes the information from one neuron does not reach the postsynaptic neuron due to synaptic failures, due to failures in synaptic transmission, due to neuronal death, and many other sources of noise. As a matter of fact, sometimes you think, experimenters think that they are doing exactly the same experiment, and neurons do not respond in the same way. So this type of stochasticity has been capitalized in the neural network community by using techniques such as dropout. The idea is that during training neural networks, you randomly remove some of the weights or some of the neurons from the training algorithms in such a way that you can achieve a more robust solution. So now, by doing that, the solution that you get at the end does not rely exclusively on one or a few individual units, but the information has to be, you're enforcing essentially the solution to be distributed over the entire network. Again, an idea that was inspired by work in neuroscience. The other idea that has been quite prominent in the neural network community is derived from the notion that, at least in the sensory systems, in the visual system, the auditory system, information seems to propagate in an approximately hierarchical fashion. So to solve the problem of vision, and I will come back to this on Thursday when we talk more about the visual system, to solve the problem of vision, that is to be able to recognize objects and to be able to understand the visual scene, you don't try to solve that in one single step. Biology seems to have come up with a divide and conquer strategy. So you divide that problem into multiple steps, and the problem is solved in a hierarchical fashion through multiple layers. And this gave rise to the idea of deep architectures, the idea that you can concatenate multiple layers one after the other, and given a fixed number of neurons, if the number of computational units in the system is the same, deep networks are much more efficient at solving a wide variety of problems than completely shallow networks, that have only one layer. So this combining all of these different steps and intercalating these different types of layers, and the idea of synaptic plasticity by changing weights, and the idea of deep structures by concatenating these and putting and having multiple layers. A few years ago, there was a major transformation in the neural network community implemented by an algorithm called AlexNet, which was done by Alex Krusevsky. And the basic idea here is that you start with an image, and what you're trying to do is solve problems of image classification. That is, take an image and be able to say, is there a person there? Is there a chair there? Is there a table? Is there a dog? What kind of object is present in that image? So you start with an RGB representation of that image. So you have the red, green, blue pixels in the image. Those images go into a convolutional layer. That is, you're extracting features in a fashion more or less similar to what Hubel and Wiesel discovered via orientation tuning. That goes through a normalization step, through a pooling step, that rectifying linear unit that I mentioned earlier. And then the same process is repeated over and over throughout this cascade. So there are more convolutional layers, more normalization layers, and so on. In each one of these steps, there are weights. There are knobs that essentially you can tune in order to solve the problem. So the idea is that you are going to train a network. You have a lot of images here. People downloaded hundreds of thousands of images from the internet. Those images were labeled, so you know that you can train these networks with enormous computational resources. There were a lot of tricks that went into making efficient use of those resources, using graphic processing units, using the GPU to accelerate computation. But if we take aside some of these computational tricks, the basic idea is to implement some of these fundamental principles from neuroscience into these deep convolutional networks, then train these networks and change those weights in order to achieve an output here. In this case, the output is a vector of 1,000 numbers, which corresponds to the probability that each one of 1,000 different object classes were there. So those classes, again, were chairs or tables or dogs or elephants and so on. So you can imagine one number for each one of those categories that indicates how likely is it that this particular image contains that object. And this algorithm, essentially, these are the error rates that algorithm achieved in 2012. And those algorithms surpassed essentially any computer vision algorithm that many other engineers and computer scientists had been working on for a very long time. That gave rise to a race and an explosion of different algorithms, building deeper and deeper networks. There are networks now that have more than 100 different layers. And there were essentially concomitant decreases in the error rates. These networks became quite proficient at many of these labeling tasks. So much so that some people even dare to say that the problem of computer vision was solved, that essentially we can label all sorts of things in these images. And as I'm going to argue later, this is far from the case. The performance is quite impressive. We can do a lot of things. Many of you may have phones that can recognize your face decently well. We have lots of devices that can do amazing things. But we're very far from solving completely the problem of intelligence in the context of vision, let alone in other domains. Okay, so here I want to list, give you a quick overview of some accomplishments of this type of deep convolutional networks and some sort of things that they have excelled at doing. So one example is that's pretty old now is the idea that you can recognize handwritten digits. So you can take these images and determine whether that's a 0, a 2, a 3, etc. The particular set of images that I described in which these algorithms have been extensively tested is known as ImageNet. This is a data set containing at least 1,000 categories. There are new incarnations with more categories, thousands of images in each one of those categories. And then you can take these networks and, again, train them to be able to put labels in those images quite successfully. These networks are so successful that in many cases they can surpass humans. So in some sense, they have passed already certain simplified versions of the Turing test for vision. For example, in the context of facial recognition, there are people that are super recognizers. Some people are better than others at recognizing faces. So if you take some of the best human face recognizers out there, or if you take forensic experts, some of these deep convolutional networks can do much better at face recognition than these experts. These networks are extremely good at other recognition problems, such as recognizing whether a mammogram has breast cancer or not. This is a yes-no question. It's a classical domain of pattern recognition problems. And many of these networks can do this at the level of, or even in some cases better than, expert clinicians. Here's another example. This is a picture of the eye called the fundus photograph. So you're looking at the back of the eye, essentially. And so from these images, ophthalmologists can diagnose a series of diseases. One of them is diabetes of retinopathy. And then again, machines can do this extremely well at the level of expert clinicians. What's impressive is that not only can they do that, but they can discover a lot of other information in these images that clinicians never even thought of. For example, the networks are able to take these pictures and determine whether that person is a male or a female, and even approximate the person's age. Of course, that's not very interesting for clinicians. Clinicians have the patient in front of them. They know whether the person is a female or a male and what the age is. But what's particularly impressive is that there's a recent paper suggesting that you can take these images and be able to predict the risk of cardiovascular disease. So this is something that nobody ever thought of, but by correlating the massive amounts of data from these pictures with other measurements, investigators were able to do, again, use deep convolutional networks combined with machine learning and do better than some of the framing scores and other scores that people have been using to diagnose cardiovascular disease or the risk of cardiovascular disease for decades. So there's a lot of other information that these networks are able to extract. People are using this for classifying plants in zoology better than expert zoologists, the classification of galaxies for astronomers. And many of these approaches have gone now well beyond visual classification domain. So if you change the input pattern, if instead of using that RGB input, you use other types of information there, you can use these for these type of networks for speech recognition, for sentiment analysis, for predictive advertising, for predicting earthquakes, and for a wide variety of other problems. As a matter of fact, deep convolutional networks and AI seem to be everywhere now. There are plenty of examples, again, on a weekly basis of how they can be applied to a wide variety of different problems. So maybe one should ask, what can deep networks do? And despite all of these amazing accomplishments, there's still lots and lots of problems that cannot be solved by deep convolutional networks, including some very simple vision problems. For example, if you have an object and you want to know whether that object is inside or outside another object, or inside or outside a particular surface, that sounds like a relatively simple problem, and yet it's pretty challenging for current deep convolutional networks to be able to learn that from multiple examples. In addition to that, humans are able to learn from very few examples a lot of tasks without the need to have millions and millions of labels. So we'll come back to these ideas. So these deep convolutional networks that seem to be everywhere and solve so many tasks so well are essentially based on very simple notions of neuroscience. But I would argue that there's major progress in many fronts in neuroscience, and that AI is falling behind, that we have lots of work to do in terms of trying to incorporate recent advances in neuroscience. And I want to give you a few examples of a couple of things that are happening in terms of technologies to be able to understand the brain better, that I think will play a tremendous role in accelerating the possibility of translating some of those ideas from biology into computational algorithms and better AI. So I'm going to go through this rather quickly. So the first one that I want to mention is the idea of being able to extract circuit-like diagrams of nervous tissue. So if you have a device such as a computer and you want to know how it works, one of the first questions you may ask is, what's the circuit diagram? What's inside? What are the elements? And how are they connected to each other? So there has been enormous progress over the last decade, including work by people, by extremely talented people like Jeff Lichtman, in using electron microscopy techniques to be able to map neural circuits at enormous resolution. Essentially, we can now take a piece of tissue from cortex and figure out, essentially in a saturated fashion, figure out what all the elements are, what are the cells within that within that piece of tissue, where are the dendrites, where are the somas, where are the axons, even subcellular components such as spines and mitochondria, and we can label every single one of those elements and how they connect to each other. I'm going to skip some of the details of how this is done. For these, as well as many of the other points that we put forward in the lectures, you can download the slides, and there will be references as well as some of the videos that show this in more detail. The second technique that I want to mention is the ability to record activity of large numbers of neurons simultaneously. By and large, over the last several decades in neuroscience, we've been looking at the activity of single neurons at a time. The heroic experiments that I mentioned earlier by Hubel and Wiesel involved looking at the activity of one neuron and trying to discover from the activity of that neuron what's happening in the circuit. So imagine that you have an orchestra composed of 100 different instruments or 1,000 or tens of thousands of such instruments. And you're trying to appreciate the music by looking at one instrument at a time. Of course, you can get a lot about what's happening with one instrument at a time, but you'll be missing a lot of the music by doing so. So in a similar vein, it's fundamental in neuroscience to be able to study multiple neurons together, and there are specific aspects of those computations that I suspect will be revealed by our increasing ability to record from more and more neurons. So this is coming in at least 2 different flavors. One of them is through the use of printing devices and nanotechnology to build much better electrodes than ever before. So people are able to build these type of electrodes that have multiple different sensors along the electrode to be able to capture the activity of many, many types of neurons. And then another type of technique that has been become more and more prominent in neuroscience is the use of imaging technologies. In this case, this is 2-photon imaging technologies to be able to listen to the activity of many neurons. Not only the number of neurons has increased enormously, but also the stability of the recording. So now we can begin to ask questions about how neurons behave, not only on time scales of a few seconds to a few hours, but maybe even follow the same neurons over weeks and months and study developmental questions as well as learning aspects of learning that were not accessible before. I think this is the old version of the slides, but anyway. So the other technique that I wanted to mention is a technique called optogenetics. So most of what you can do by recording the activity of multiple neurons involves a correlation between neuronal activity and the presentation of a particular sensory stimulus, or a correlation between neuronal activity and some form of behavior. Most of the techniques to go from correlations to try to establish some sort of causality between activity and behavior or stimuli were typically very coarse. And recently, through the work of people like Ed Boyden as well as many others, we now have the opportunity to be able to disrupt the system, either activating neurons or silencing neurons with unprecedented resolution. So the basic idea here is that one can combine the precision of molecular biology that can give us access to specific ion channels. Ion channels are proteins that are along the membrane of neurons and essentially dictate the flow of ions inside and outside of the neuron. That is, the activation of the neuron can be controlled by these ion channels. The expression of these ion channels depends on our understanding of molecular biology, of the specific promoters that dictate when and where a particular gene or particular protein is expressed. So by combining the specificity of molecular biology with light-sensitive proteins and shining stimulation in specific brain regions, they came up with techniques that allow us to causally intervene with circuits. So this is now being used to be able to silence specific circuits of neurons at specific times in a reversible manner, and also to potentially activate specific neurons. You could imagine what some people refer to as playing the piano, activating particular patterns of neurons in the circuit. I want to take 2 very quick tangents. We are interested in understanding brains because we think that understanding neurons and biology will help us build better AI algorithms. But it's also the case that brains are probably the most precious devices on Earth. These are numbers that are a little bit outdated, but they represent the fraction of people in the US with mental diseases, and the numbers are staggering. So being able to solve how the brain works and being able to address computations in the brain is not only interesting from a technological perspective, but also to alleviate what's probably one of the most important and challenging health problems of our time, problems that cost the US about $200 billion a year. Another aspect that I think will be quite fascinating in terms of being able to decipher neuronal function and understanding neuroscience is the idea that we may be able to, for the first time, begin to propose actual models and biologically based frameworks to understand what's perhaps one of the most elusive questions of all time. That is, how consciousness emerges from the activity of neurons. That is, the feeling of consciousness, which has been traditionally a matter of speculation and philosophy and all types of discussions. Now, for the very first time, I think that there are serious efforts, and with this novel set of techniques, it's become possible to begin to ask questions about what are the specific correlates of consciousness sensations. So this, we have to thank Francis Crick and Christoph Koch for putting forward the idea that we might really be able to tackle these using serious scientific, neuroscientific methods. So just to give you a flavor of how people are studying the problem of consciousness, people have used a particular paradigm called binocular rivalry. Under normal circumstances, what you see through your right eye and your left eye is very similar. It's not exactly identical. So if you cover one eye or cover the other eye, you can see that it's not exactly the same. And the very small differences between what you see through your right eye and your left eye can be used for stereopsis, for being able to have a sense of depth perception. But in the lab, you can actually show something completely different to the right eye and to the left eye. So let's say that I show you a chair in your right eye and a tree in your left eye, or in this case, a red tilted grating in one eye, and then a blue grating with a different orientation to the other eye. The brain gets confused, and instead of merging the two, what happens is that the brain tries to come up with a single interpretation of reality, of what's out there. And what happens at the perceptual level is that people report that sometimes they see one stimulus, sometimes they see the other. And this changes in a seemingly random fashion without the subject's control. So even though there's nothing changing externally at the level of the eyes, the inputs are completely constant, something in the subject's brains is actually changing so that you are conscious of one particular stimulus or the other. So by looking at the activity of individual neurons, people have begun to elucidate which particular parts of the visual system correlate with the subjective report and which particular parts of the visual system are completely oblivious to these perceptual changes. So there are parts of the visual system that are interested in the external sensory inputs and other parts that reflect the inner subjective consciousness of the subjects. Ascribing consciousness to machines, I think, is a very elusive topic, and we're very far from understanding exactly why we would want to do that and what would convince us that a machine has some sort of level of consciousness or not. However, in terms of practical matters, my guess is that people will be able to will tend to ascribe some sort of feeling or some sort of consciousness to machines pretty easy. I think people are willing to do that very well. So one particular example, some of you may be familiar with these Tamagotchi devices. These are devices that I would argue have absolutely no intelligence whatsoever. Basically, there's a random number generator that dictates that all of a sudden these devices that it's hungry, or it's sick, or it's happy, or it's crying. And then people were incredibly attached to these extremely simple devices that have no resemblance to biology and absolutely no deep convolutional network, no neural network, no AI, no nothing. There was an interesting article in the New York Times recently about people falling in love with machines. I'm always impressed when people show these robots. These are humanoid robots that are probably the best out there in terms of locomotion and dexterity and balance, and they're pretty impressive. And then in order to train and in order to test these robots, humans do this sort of thing. So they move their boxes, they push them, and a lot of people in the audience tend to be quite scandalized by what this human is doing. They think that this human is doing very evil because of the kind of ways in which these robots are trained. Now, I think most of us would argue that there is absolutely no consciousness whatsoever in the Tamagotchi or in these type of robots. Yet I think that once you have a device that has some sort of locomotion, maybe even some inkling of volition, if we can solve or make progress in terms of language, I think people will be extremely willing to ascribe some basic notion of feeling of consciousness. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, and we can debate about that. But I think that people will be quite inclined to do that in the not too distant future. AI has made enormous progress, but I should also mention that there are a lot of people that are very concerned about the potential perils of AI. So I want to spend just a couple of minutes just mentioning some of the concerns that people have raised about the advancement of AI. So one of them is the Terminator-like scenarios, the idea that robots will take over the world and kill everyone because of competition for resources and so on. I think that's very unlikely. Outside of Hollywood, I don't think that that's going to happen. More seriously, I think one of the main issues that people have talked about extensively is the idea of the rapid redistribution of the labor force, the idea that we may be at the verge of a new industrial revolution, perhaps a revolution that's grander than the Industrial Revolution, such that the job market may be distributed in a different way. A lot of jobs may disappear, and the speed at which the job market will change may actually be quite fast, and society may struggle with catching up. Our educational system, our society, our politics, our regulation may have to catch up with the advent of AI. There are a lot of concerns about military applications of AI, about being able to hack robots for evil purposes, or even completely design and train machines for some sort of evil purpose. People are also concerned about computer bugs. So if you ever code, I bet you that you often have bugs, and the code doesn't do exactly what you intended it to do, and that's likely to happen in the context of machines, in the context of AI. Of course, humans make mistakes too. So the question here is more of a quantitative one. How do we instill safe regulations and safe practices to ensure that even if the code is not completely bug-free, that we can actually make progress despite all of these errors. People have also been concerned about biases in the training data. For example, if you build an algorithm that excels at face recognition, it turns out that many of the current algorithms for face recognition have an enormous bias towards white male faces. And their performance may be very good with white male faces, but their performance may be a little bit lower with female faces, or with people who have a different skin color, or with people who have different shapes of faces. So these are inherent biases in the training data set. And of course, again, I would argue that humans have biases too, in particular in the context of face recognition. There are well-known other race effects. We tend to be much better at recognizing people that are closer to those that we have more experience with, closer to the people that we grew up with, and very bad at recognizing people from other races. So the idea that there are biases is very true. It's not unique to machines. If anything, I would argue that it's probably easier to change biases in algorithms than to change human biases. Another problem that people have mentioned is the lack of understanding of what the circuit, of what the algorithms do. And I'm personally a bit less concerned about this. I'm not sure exactly what people mean by understanding. I think that we understand many of these algorithms extremely well. That is, we can describe mathematically exactly what's going on in each one of these steps. And I think that's what I call understanding. The language of science is mathematics. We don't need to translate things into a verbal type of report. As a matter of fact, I would argue that sometimes translating what a machine is doing or what an algorithm is doing into some sort of language-based description will hinder progress rather than accelerate progress. And I would argue further that in many cases we don't understand how humans make decisions either. So if you have an algorithm that can detect whether a particular picture has a tumor or not, you may go to a doctor, and the doctor may come up with and invent some sort of explanation of how he's doing it or how she's doing it. But at the end of the day, we don't really understand the decision processes that they go through either. So I don't think there is much of a difference here in terms of what people refer to as understanding. What's perhaps more serious than understanding is that we may not understand or be able to foresee what the limitations of the algorithms are and what conditions will they fail. And that's perhaps a more important problem. I think there's a lot of interesting questions about the social, mental, and political consequences of having machines that are better than we are in many tasks, about the problems with the job market that I alluded to, having machines that are creative. What if we have machines that can produce songs that are in the US top 40 Billboard? What if we have machines that can create art, and we like art created by machines better than humans? So I think there's a lot of important consequences that we may see in the coming years. And the other thing is that a lot of this happens very fast, much faster than the development of
oder frei agieren kann, sollte es jetzt in der Mitte.
Okay. In the other version, I'm sorry, I had to switch computers. In the other one, I had the sound off. I'm originally from Argentina, so I had to show something about soccer. So before we get too excited about all the enormous capabilities of AI, before we get too scared about Terminator-like scenarios destroying the world, I want to say that we're still very, very, very far from general AI. And I hope that throughout this class we'll give you examples of where we are, of the kind of problems that we have solved, and all the enormous challenges ahead. So what I wanted to illustrate here is what I think is probably one of the best soccer players of all time, Lionel Messi, mind you, from Argentina. He was playing here, he was scoring here. I stopped that, not because it's not beautiful, but because of the sound. And here, this is a little bit outdated, but we haven't gone much further. This is the World Cup in robot soccer. Yes, there is such a thing. And if you actually look at this video, it's very, very primitive. So part of this is about dexterity, about balance, and so on. But even if we solve problems about dexterity, about balance, and those things, these robots fall all the time. It's kind of funny to watch that. Even if we solve all of that, there's much more that has to be going on here. You have to understand the game. You have to understand what the opponents are going to do. You need to understand agents and their intentions and their interactions. You need to be able to make predictions. I think that we're extremely far from being able to do that. So the other problem that I want to highlight, there are many, many problems. I could go on and on describing lots of AI problems that we're not even close to solving yet. But I want to give one example which is right at the heart of visual recognition problems. So again, machines have excelled at certain problems such as, here's a picture, is there a chair in the picture, yes or no? So machines have become quite proficient at doing that. Machines have become quite proficient at doing face recognition. But here's a problem that I think illustrates how far we are. So imagine that I give you a picture, and I want to predict humor. I want to predict graphical humor, whether a picture is funny or not. Now, you can argue that there are variations between humans, right? So humor depends on your culture, it depends on who you are, it depends on the context, it depends on your gender, it may depend on how you were raised, it may depend on a lot of things. But by and large, there is some basic human average that we can assign to each picture, saying how funny a given picture is or isn't. I don't think that we're even close to being able to build machines or algorithms, no matter how many examples you put in there, that will predict how funny a given image will be. So in order to understand whether a particular picture is funny or not, it's not sufficient to be able to label what's in there. We have machines that excel at telling who this elegant gentleman here is. We have machines that can do that extremely well. But I don't think that we have any way of understanding why this particular picture is humorous, or what's actually going on here. What is this animal here? What is this chicken here thinking, and why? So I think being able to take a picture, and I'm not even asking to explain why you think it's funny or why you think it's not funny. Even just produce a binary output. I want to give you a picture, and I want to be able to say, most humans will think that this is funny. Most humans will think this is not funny. That's a very simple binary question, and I don't think that we're even remotely close to solve that type of question. So we have a very long way to go. So I want to stop here And I want to spend a few minutes now talking about logistics about the class. And then I'll be happy to take questions. OK, so I already mentioned you can, if you have access to, for most of you, if you have access to the Canvas website, you can go here, and we'll put all of the information there. If you're not registered through here, we ask you that you communicate with Nimrod and you send him your email so that you can be added to the email list. And we'll be also posting everything here that you can log in. You can see everything in there without a login. We have secured this place now. I know there was a lot of confusion about room numbers. I apologize for that. When we saw that there were more people than we had thought of would enroll, we had to change rooms. So we're going to be here. The website will include slides, suggested reading. We hope to post the videos as well as link to other information. I'm only going to be giving a few of the lectures, and then most of the lectures will be presented by an amazing cadre of scholars that we have, mostly here at Harvard, a few from MIT as well. They're all shown here. They come from a wide variety of backgrounds. We have mathematicians, we have computer scientists, we have hardcore physicists turned neuroscientists, and so on and so forth. So the goal here is to give you a diverse set of perspectives on the latest and greatest at the interface of biology and AI. And some of these lectures will be somewhat tilted towards the computer science side of things. Some of them will be more tilted towards psychology. Some of them will be tilted more towards neuroscience. But the idea is to bring all of these perspectives together. And as I already argued several times, we think that there is major progress to be made by understanding brain function and translating some of those ideas from biological code into algorithms. I already showed Nimrod. He's the main person here. Feel free to contact him as well as me if you have any questions. Hopefully there will be a few more pictures of one or two more TAs soon. Grades. So 10% will be about class participation. I know that people have been extremely shy today. Maybe it's because of my accent. I hope that in the future people will participate more. I'm going to talk about projects very, very soon. You'll have to do a midterm presentation of the projects that you're going to be working on, and then the final project presentation, and then most of your grade will be determined by what you did in that project and the final project report. So there's a link here to projects. You have to pick one of those projects. You cannot pick two. You cannot pick zero. You have to pick only one. This link, the way it's set up right now, it goes to one of us, and we have to give you permission to access that. So if you click on that and you cannot access this, it may take a few minutes or a few hours. But probably by tonight, you should all have access to the list of projects. So the projects have essentially two different flavors. We're not going to be teaching you how to code or how to program. So if you've never done any computer programming whatsoever, if you're not comfortable with trying things out in computers and code and so on, there's a couple of projects that are essentially essays or literature review on different topics. And we have specific suggestions on topics, as well as, if you click on them, specific questions that we want you to address. For example, in the context of deep convolutional network architectures, one of the questions may be, what are the problems that can be solved by these networks? What are the problems that cannot be solved by these networks, and why? So your goal will be to be writing a review on the latest and greatest on these topics. So these are more about literature review and expressing your views on these topics. Most of the projects involve some amount of computer programming. And they have to do with a variety of state-of-the-art questions in computer science, in computational neuroscience, and in AI. So we're not going to be teaching you how to code, but we will have TAs as well as many of the faculty that I showed, and including myself, that will be able to help you and guide you in terms of computational resources, in terms of references, in terms of any help that you need to be able to accomplish and pursue these projects. These projects vary in difficulty. Some of them involve reproducing and re-implementing things that people have done already in the past, all the way to open problems that I think are extremely challenging. So just to give you an idea, I put in there the project of predicting humor. The idea is you have a lot of pictures. Can you predict whether those pictures are funny or not? I think that project is essentially impossible right now with current techniques, but I'm happy to see if anybody actually wants to try, and I would be very happy to be proven wrong. So there's a wide variety of projects with different degrees of difficulty. I'd like to encourage people to choose the projects relatively soon. Don't wait until one day before the midterm presentation to start thinking about your project. And we are here to discuss your ideas about the project and any questions that you may have. I had added a couple of slides. I forgot what I had to say, but OK, I think that's it. I will take questions. Yes? That's one of the slides that, unfortunately, I had to switch computers, and that's not in here. So that's a good question. So you're welcome to talk to other people in the class, talk to use any resources out there, books, internet, YouTube, any source out there. But at the end of the day, the projects are individual. Okay, so you have to have your own project. There may be many people working on the same project, and that's fine. Okay, but at the end of the day, we want one report from every single one of you. Okay, if you're there's an academic integrity policy that's on the web. You can look at that, but the basic rules apply. If you are going to copy something from the web, you have to indicate the sources and quote it. You're welcome to use existing code and download code there. And I realize that the modern way of coding is grabbing things from one place, grabbing from the other, and putting it together. You're welcome to do those things. All we ask is that you actually tell us exactly what you're doing and where you're taking things from. At the end of the day, you'll be giving two presentations. One is a work in progress presentation, and that's, if I remember correctly, March 14 or mid-March. And the other one is a full presentation at the end of the project. You also have to turn in a report on the project, and if it's a project that involves code, you have to turn in that code that you used in there as well. You can talk to other people, you can collaborate with people, but at the end of the day, you have to have your own signature, your own flavor, your own way of doing things, and that's what we expect from you in the class. Other questions? Yes? Yes, I was afraid somebody was going to ask that. That's a very good question. The report has to be perfect. Length is less relevant than making sure that it's perfect. I know that people want length, so I'm going to come up with a number. But I care more about quality than quantity. But I will come up with a number because I know people want to see. Yes. The report is the essay. That's what we're writing. Okay, and it's the same thing. Yes. So the essay is the report. Okay. That's the final paper. Okay, and that's due at the end of the class. All right. Yes. So you're welcome to come up with a related topic. What we ask is if you want to come up with a different, if you don't like any of these projects or you think you have a better project, that's fine too. But you need approval for that from the TAs or from one of the instructors, one of the people that I showed the picture in there, or from me, just to make sure that if you're going to be working on a project about string theory is fascinating, but that has nothing to do with the course. Okay, so if it's related to the topics here and we think that it's a reasonable project, I'm happy to entertain coming up with your own adventures and your own projects, and that's fine too. Yeah. Any other questions? For those of you who arrived late, we're filming the lectures and we need you to sign a consent form. So talk to Nimrod. Some of the papers are, you need to sign to get this signed. Okay? All right, so if there are no further questions, that's it, and I'll see you on Thursday then. All right.